There comes a moment in every soul's life when the structures you've built, brick by brick, breath by breath, begin to tremble. You wake up, and nothing feels like it once did. Not your relationships, not your purpose, not even your name in your own mouth. It's as if the stage you've been performing on has begun to collapse beneath your feet. And while the world might call this a crisis, Carl Jung called it something else entirely: the sacred death of the false self, the shedding of a skin that was never truly yours. If you're feeling unmoored right now, I invite you not to panic. There is a hidden intelligence behind this internal collapse. What you're experiencing isn't madness. It's metamorphosis. The person you once believed yourself to be, shaped by culture, by duty, by expectation, is being deconstructed. Not to destroy you, but to reveal the deeper self that has always waited in silence. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. The veil is lifting, and for the first time, you're being asked to meet your soul in the mirror. Carl Jung taught that the ego, which helps us function in the world, must eventually be challenged if we are to become whole. And that challenge often arrives uninvited, through restlessness, sorrow, or an unshakable sense that life has grown hollow. You feel it in your chest. A strange ache, a gentle earthquake that shakes the certainties you never thought you'd question. Suddenly, you're staring at your job, your family, your dreams, and wondering, did I choose this, or did it choose me? You start to question the blueprint, the plan you followed so faithfully, only to discover it never truly fit. Success feels empty. Smiles feel rehearsed. You walk into a room and feel like a ghost of your former self, not because you're broken, but because you're awakening to the truth that the world outside has defined you for too long, and your inner world is now fighting to be heard. You are no longer content to wear masks just to be loved. This is what Jung called the disintegration of the old ego, the moment when the scaffolding of your identity starts to fall away. You find yourself examining the life you've constructed like a stranger examining another's belongings. The house, the habits, the routines, they no longer feel like home. Even the words you speak begin to taste foreign on your tongue. And it's in this sacred confusion that the seeds of individuation are planted. Most people will tell you to fix the problem, to set goals, to think positive. But this is not a problem to fix. It is a passage to walk. Jung reminded us that the shadow, the parts of ourselves we've denied or repressed, will surface not to harm us, but to invite us inward. That anxiety you feel, that sadness that clings to your mornings, it's your soul knocking on the door you've kept shut for too long. It's time to open it. At first, the questions come like whispers. Who am I? Why am I here? Is this what I really want? And then they get louder, more persistent. They haunt your sleep. They follow you into conversation. You nod, you laugh, but deep inside you are elsewhere, drifting in a realm where the old answers no longer soothe. This is not depression. This is descent. The descent that precedes rebirth. You are not dying. You are being reshaped. A man once told me that after the death of his mother, he stopped recognizing his own life. Every ritual that once grounded him now felt meaningless. So he walked away, not from grief, but toward it. Into the woods. Into silence. Into the quiet mystery of being alone with his thoughts for the first time in years. And it was there, with no job title, no phone signal, and no audience, that he finally heard the voice within. We are not taught how to dismantle ourselves. We are taught how to succeed, how to achieve, how to perform. But no one teaches us how to pause and say, this life no longer fits. And yet, Carl Jung insisted, the soul knows. The soul will rebel, and the rebellion may look like burnout, like doubt, like detachment. But beneath that unrest is a sacred clarity, the knowledge that you cannot continue as you were. Your ego may scream, your friends may worry, society may urge you to stay the course. But something deeper will not be silenced. That something is the self, the eternal part of you that existed long before the world named you. When the ego begins to crumble, the self begins to rise, like a phoenix beneath the ash. And its arrival feels like both loss and liberation. You may cry for no reason. You may feel like you're grieving someone who hasn't died. That someone is the you who lived for others. The you who was always available, always agreeable, always seeking approval. That version is now dissolving, not because it was wrong, but because it was never whole. And in the space left behind, a new silence grows. A silence rich with the hum of truth. You begin to notice the little things. The way your body resists obligations. The way your laughter feels strained. The way your laughter feels strained. The way you say, "I'm fine," but know you're lying. These are signs, divine ones, symbols from the unconscious trying to get your attention. This is not about fixing what's broken. This is about making room for what's real. The world may not understand what you're going through, but Carl Jung would. He would call it the invitation to individuation, the sacred, painful, necessary journey into your true self. And it always begins like this, with confusion, with sorrow, with questions that no longer go away. If you're in this place now, you are not alone. You are standing at the edge of the old world, ready to step into the mystery of the new. And that step, only you can take it. The door does not open with force. It opens with honesty, with courage, with the quiet decision to no longer lie to yourself. The beautiful chapter you are seeking will not arrive with fanfare. It begins now, in this moment, with the decision to stay with the question instead of rushing toward an answer. There is a moment, often quiet and unnoticed, when the things that once defined you begin to loosen their grip. You find yourself sitting in a room full of familiar voices and laughter, yet your heart feels somewhere else, as if watching from the edge of a dream you've already awakened from. You try to reconnect, to laugh as you once did, but something has shifted. The past no longer wraps itself around you like it used to. And the strangest part, no one else notices, only you feel it. That quiet disconnection. Carl Jung described this as the unraveling of the old identity. A sacred unraveling. It's not about rejecting the past. It's about outgrowing it. Like a snake shedding its skin, you begin to peel away layers that once served you but now feel foreign. The friends, the habits, even the joys that used to color your life start to feel dull. Not because they have changed, but because you have. Something in you has expanded. And now what once felt like home feels like a hallway you've already walked down too many times. You still show up. You still go through the motions. But there's a silence behind your eyes. An awareness that what once thrilled you now leaves you strangely untouched. It's not apathy, it's evolution. And this shift can feel like grief, grieving the parts of your life that no longer resonate. You try to explain it, but how do you tell someone that the very soil you were rooted in no longer nourishes you? Jung wrote about this as a phase of detachment, where the ego loses its grip and the deeper self begins to stir. You're not losing your past, you're releasing your dependence on it. You no longer need to belong to the person you once were. And yet, there's pain in that freedom, because every step forward means letting go of the hand you once held so tightly, even if it was your own. A woman I once met described this perfectly. She had spent 15 years in a high-profile career, surrounded by power and influence. On paper, she had everything. But every day she felt like an actress in a play she no longer remembered auditioning for. One morning, after a boardroom presentation, she walked into the bathroom, looked into the mirror, and whispered, "I don't know this woman." That was the beginning of her becoming. She left everything behind, not to escape, but to come home to herself. You may feel this too. The old stories replay, but they no longer move you. The friendships continue, but the connection feels thin. It's like hearing a song you once loved, but now the melody stirs no feeling. You haven't become heartless. You've become honest. The role you played to survive is unraveling, and the self is stepping out from behind the curtain. This is not loss. This is liberation. You might find yourself drawn to solitude, not out of sadness, but because noise no longer soothes. You want fewer words, deeper truths, and space to breathe without performance. This is the soul's way of reclaiming your attention. Not everything that once mattered was false, but some of it no longer fits the architecture of who you are becoming. And that's okay. Evolution often requires you to say goodbye without resentment. Jung said that to become whole, we must accept the death of who we were, not as a tragedy, but as a rite of passage. And like all sacred rituals, it demands reverence. You may feel alone, unsure, suspended in between. But in this liminal space, transformation is happening. Beneath the surface, you are molting, shedding, preparing. And though you can't see it yet, something truer is taking shape. Letting go doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it's a simple refusal to keep pretending. You stop trying to reignite old fires. You stop forcing conversations. You stop explaining your silence. You just let it fall away. And when it does, a lightness returns. Not joy exactly, but space, room to breathe. Room to rediscover the voice that's been whispering beneath the noise. This is the space between stories. The part where the old script ends, but the new one hasn't yet begun. It's the sacred pause, the inhale before the leap. And it's here, in the quiet, that the self begins to speak. Not in words, but in sensations. Longing, curiosity, a strange pull toward something you can't yet name. This is the beginning of individuation, your soul stepping forward to author its own life. You may feel empty, but you are not broken. You are making space. Space for something more aligned, more alive, more honest. This void you feel is not a punishment. It is a preparation. The universe is not punishing you by removing the familiar. It is creating conditions where only what is real can remain. You're not losing your life. You're losing what was never truly yours. Others may not understand. They may accuse you of being distant, strange, withdrawn. But you are not abandoning them. You are simply returning to yourself. And in that return, you're remembering what it feels like to be whole. The discomfort you feel is not a mistake. It's a compass pointing inward, asking you to stay a while longer in the mystery. And in time, the ache softens. The disconnection becomes clarity. The silence becomes peace. You begin to see the beauty of not knowing, the elegance of simplicity. And without effort, new connections appear, ones that match your new frequency. You no longer chase, you attract. You no longer perform. You become. Because once the past lets go of you, the future no longer feels like a place you must earn, but a home you are finally allowed to enter. This is the truth Carl Jung knew well. You must lose your way to find your path. And if you're in the middle of the loss, take heart. You are exactly where you need to be. The world you knew is fading, not to punish you, but to reveal the world that waits. There comes a point where all the definitions you were given of success, love, purpose, begin to crumble in your hands. Not because you've failed, but because you've outgrown the story they belong to. You once believed that achievement meant meaning, that admiration meant connection, that a carefully planned life meant peace. But now, with all the right things in place, something inside you feels profoundly absent. And so, the question emerges, not from your mind, but from your being. What truly matters to me? This is the moment when the soul begins to speak. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rush. It simply rises like mist at dawn, quiet and undeniable. Carl Jung described this as the death of false values. The moment when the outer world, no matter how polished, no longer aligns with your inner truth. You begin to realize that most of what you've been chasing was given to you by someone else. Parents, culture, institutions, the collective dream. And now, that dream no longer sustains you. You find yourself questioning what once felt obvious. The prestigious career, the degree, the financial stability, even the praise of others. All of it once lit you up like a lighthouse. But now it flickers and fades. You look around and ask, is this really living? Or have I just been surviving in style? You are not being ungrateful. You are being honest. The truth is whispering now, and it refuses to be silent. Jung believed that the crisis of values is the gateway to the soul. When you no longer believe what you once clung to, you are not becoming cynical. You are becoming real. You begin to see that being busy is not the same as being alive, that being admired is not the same as being loved, that being comfortable is not the same as being fulfilled. And so you start to pull away not out of rebellion, but out of reverence for something deeper. It's like waking up in the middle of your own life and realizing you've been reading from a script written by strangers, every scene polished, every line expected. And suddenly, the desire to improvise, to speak your own words, becomes irresistible. You don't need to burn the script. You just stop pretending it's yours. And that subtle act of refusal becomes your first sacred rebellion. You may feel alone in this shift, but you are not. Many walk this path silently. A man in his 30s once told me he had spent a decade building his family's legacy, only to wake one day and realize he'd never asked himself what kind of life he wanted. Not once. He hadn't failed them, but he had forgotten himself. And so he stepped back, not to destroy the legacy, but to ask, can I live in truth and still honor where I came from? This questioning can feel like betrayal, but Jung would remind us, it is not betrayal to ask, what do I believe in now? It is not betrayal to admit, I have changed. These are the first signs of authenticity. You begin to notice what lifts you and what drains you, what feels like obligation, and what feels like devotion. The more honest you become, the less room there is for pretending. You start to feel drawn toward simplicity, toward stillness. A walk in the late afternoon sun becomes more meaningful than any networking event. A single conversation that touches the heart means more than 1,000 shallow interactions. You begin to find beauty in what cannot be measured, in moments, in meaning, in the quiet ways your soul breathes when you finally stop striving. This is not regression. This is refinement. You are learning to live without the need for applause, to speak without the need to be understood, to wake each morning and choose what feels alive, not what looks impressive. You are becoming sovereign. Your values are no longer imposed, they are chosen, and that choice changes everything. Sometimes the questions come like lightning, other times like dew, but always they come with a clarity you cannot unsee. What do I want to give this life of mine to? What am I willing to let go of so that I can hold what is real? These are not questions you answer once. They become companions, walking beside you as you sculpt a life you can finally call your own. Jung taught that the self, the deepest truth within us, emerges only when the ego's values collapse, only when the maps we've followed no longer lead us anywhere. In that silence, something ancient stirs. Not a new idea, but a buried knowing. A sense that there has always been another way to live. One rooted in truth, in presence, in soul. You begin to feel the difference between a goal and a calling. One pushes, the other pulls. One demands performance, the other invites presence. You begin to let go of anything that asks you to shrink, twist, or betray your essence. You no longer chase a life that sparkles. You crave one that sings. This is the sacred reconstruction of meaning, not handed to you, but authored by you. And the beauty is, You don't need to figure it all out today. You only need to honor the shift, to admit that you're changing, and to let that truth lead you, one breath at a time, into a life where the outer world finally echoes the music of your inner one. In Jung's words, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. If you're beginning to shed what no longer matters, you're not lost. You're aligning. You're not failing. You're returning. And what you're returning to is nothing less than the sacred origin of your own being. After the breakdown of old values, a strange new rhythm begins to emerge. It isn't loud or insistent like ambition. It's subtle, gentle, like a whisper brushing the edges of your awareness. You notice it in quiet moments, in the pause before a decision, in the tension between yes and no, in the unease that follows someone's advice. You start to realize that there's a voice inside you that isn't part of your thoughts. It doesn't argue, it doesn't reason, it simply knows. And the more you listen, the clearer it becomes. Carl Jung called this the emergence of the inner guide, the self, the archetypal wisdom that lives in all of us, but is so often drowned out by the demands of ego and conformity. What we call intuition is not a magical gift reserved for the rare. It is the ancient language of the soul, buried under years of noise, waiting patiently for the silence to return. And once you've made room for it, even accidentally, it begins to lead. It doesn't arrive as lightning. It arrives as feeling, a gentle pull, a strange clarity that bypasses logic. You might find yourself turning down an offer that sounds perfect on paper, but feels wrong in your bones. You don't know why. You just know. And later, when truth catches up with time, you see how right you were to trust it. Intuition doesn't explain itself. It simply reveals. For those who've lived a life of performance and calculation, trusting this inner sense can feel terrifying. You've been trained to seek proof, data, and approval. But the self doesn't deal in evidence. It deals in alignment. You start to see that what's logical isn't always what's true, and what's crazy isn't always what's wrong. In fact, the truest decisions often defy the mind entirely. A man once told me about the day he quit his corporate job. There was no crisis, no burnout, just a moment. He was watching a child play outside through his office window, and something inside him whispered, "This isn't it." He couldn't explain it, but in that instant, he saw the rest of his life stretched before him, like a road he had no desire to walk. And so he stepped off it. No plan, just faith. That was the beginning of his real life. Jung believed that the unconscious is always speaking to us, not through words, but through dreams, synchronicities, and sensations. You notice that every time you ignore your intuition, something in your life misaligns. You say yes to the wrong invitation and end up drained. You pursue a relationship your gut warns against and feel yourself shrinking. You push forward when your body begs for rest and end up sick. These are not punishments, they're corrections. And then you start to wonder, what would happen if I trusted this voice every time? Not just in big decisions, but in small ones too. In how you eat, who you call, where you spend your energy. You start to see life not as a series of outcomes to be controlled, but as a current to flow with, if only you can attune your inner compass. You begin to live in dialogue with the unseen. This is what Jung meant by listening to the self. Not a God outside, but a presence within. Not the voice of culture or fear, but of deep, inner knowing. It's the same force that nudged you towards certain books, certain people, certain choices. It's always been there. Only now, with the old world stripped away, you finally have ears to hear it. You begin to notice the quiet magic of synchronicity. You think of someone, and they call. You speak a longing out loud, and the answer arrives in a dream, or a song, or a stranger's casual remark. These aren't coincidences. Jung called them meaningful patterns, echoes between your inner transformation and the outer world. life becomes less random, less chaotic, and more woven. You learn to wait, to pause, to feel. You no longer rush into action just to escape uncertainty. Instead, you sit with it. You let your breath settle. And in that stillness, the right next step often appears, not as a command, but as a knowing. You begin to act not from fear or pressure, but from alignment. And that changes the entire trajectory of your life. Friends may not understand. They'll ask for reasons. But you don't have reasons anymore. You have resonance. You know what fits because it feels right. You no longer argue with your instincts. You bow to them. You begin to walk through the world like someone who is being guided from within, and you become more sensitive to everything. Beauty becomes unbearable in the best way. A breeze feels like an answer. A sunset feels like a message. You read something, and it feels like your soul has been seen. The more you follow this path, the less you need to control anything, because now you know what is meant for you will never miss you, and what isn't will never stay. This is not a passive surrender. This is an awakened trust, a courageous shift from forcing to following. And as you walk this new way, your decisions begin to look different. Not because you're trying to stand out, but because you're no longer willing to betray yourself. Intuition becomes your compass, and each time you trust it, life responds in kind. In Jung's view, to become whole is to align the conscious with the unconscious, to live in partnership with the self. This is what intuition does. It bridges the gap. It gives form to the formless, and when you listen, truly listen, you're not just living, you're remembering how to live, not by maps, not by rules, but by the wild, holy, ancient wisdom that has always lived inside of you. There comes a time when growth is no longer something you pursue for accomplishment's sake. It becomes something your soul demands. It's not a trend, not a checklist, not a phase. It's a pulse deep in your bones, a sacred unrest that refuses to let you sleepwalk through your own life. You don't want more. You want truth. You want to feel the pulse of life again, raw and real. And nothing superficial can satisfy that hunger anymore. Carl Jung called this the confrontation with the self. The moment when the false structures of the ego begin to disintegrate, not from outside force, but from the fire of your own inner longing. You don't wake up one morning and decide to evolve. No, evolution chooses you. And when it does, you will feel it. It's like your soul begins to outgrow your body, like you're a tree with roots pushing against a pot that can no longer contain your wildness. At first, you resist. Of course you do. It's terrifying to let go of the life that gave you an identity, even if that identity is suffocating you. You cling to what's familiar, even as it begins to bruise your spirit, but eventually, the discomfort becomes too great. You realize that the price of staying the same is far higher than the cost of change. And so, with trembling hands, you begin to let go. This transformation doesn't come with applause. There's no ceremony, no guidebook, just a slow, private awakening. One moment at a time, you begin saying no to what dims your light. You cancel plans, you leave jobs, you close chapters. Not because you're angry, but because you're done pretending. You're not breaking down, you're breaking through. Jung warned that what we resist persists. And when you resist your own becoming, it shows up as restlessness, as frustration, as that gnawing sense that you're meant for something more, but you can't yet name what it is. That's not failure. That's spiritual contraction, the self trying to be born through the narrow passage of your current reality. And it will keep pressing until you move. A man once told me about the day he walked out of a board meeting and never returned. I realized, he said, I was living a life that looked successful but felt like slow death. So he started over. At 50. Not because he had a plan, but because he finally had a truth, and he said the strangest thing. I've never felt more afraid or more alive. When growth becomes your compass, the old motivations begin to fade. You no longer chase status. You chase alignment. You no longer strive to be impressive. You strive to be whole. Your goals become simpler, yet more sacred. To feel deeply, to live honestly, to be free. And once you taste that kind of life, nothing less will satisfy you again. This doesn't mean the path is easy. In fact, it often begins with a kind of sacred dismantling. You lose things, comfort, certainty, even relationships that were tied to your former self. But what you gain is priceless. You gain integrity. You gain presence. You gain a life that no longer requires you to split yourself in half just to be accepted. You start saying things you once swallowed. You start walking away from roles you once performed. You begin creating not because you want to impress, but because you must. Your hands ache to shape something real. Your voice trembles with words you've held back too long. Your heart burns not with ambition, but with the need to finally speak its truth. Jung believed that true growth is not about becoming something more, but about becoming who you are, peeling away the layers of false self, returning to the original blueprint, and the only way to get there is through fire. The fire of honesty, the fire of solitude, the fire of choosing to be misunderstood rather than misaligned. You begin to notice that the more you grow, the more peaceful you feel. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become clearer. You stop trying to explain yourself to people who were never meant to understand. You stop proving your worth to systems that were never built for your liberation. You stop apologizing for the space you take up. And that clarity, it becomes a kind of quiet revolution. Some will call you selfish. Others will call you brave. But what matters is what you call yourself when you're alone. And in those quiet moments, you begin to feel proud. Not of what you've achieved, but of what you've survived. Of what you've walked away from. Of the lies you no longer carry. Of the self you're finally reclaiming. This is not the end of your growth. It's the beginning of your real life. A life not built on striving, but on soul. A life not shaped by fear, but by alignment. You will continue to evolve, not toward perfection, but toward authenticity, toward love, toward presence. And that, Jung would say, is the only growth worth pursuing. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are simply blooming in a world that often rewards the withered. And the more you lean into your own becoming, the more you'll see there is nothing more holy than choosing to grow, even when no one sees it but you. True growth eventually leads to one unavoidable crossroads: the need to release what no longer nourishes you. Not just the obvious toxins, but the subtle weights, the obligations that drain you, the roles that diminish you, the relationships that ask you to dim your light to maintain harmony. There's a moment when you look around your life and realize, I can't stay here, not because it's unbearable, but because it's untrue. Carl Jung called this part of the path the disintegration of the shadow. The old bonds that were forged from wounded places, need, fear, guilt, longing, begin to come undone. You no longer have the stomach for pretending. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become clear. You see who drains you, who confuses you, who makes you small, and instead of rationalizing their place in your life, you begin to make space. You stop fighting to be understood. You stop trying to fit yourself into rooms that always made you shrink. You don't explain your evolution. You simply honor it, and that honoring will cost you. It might cost you approval, community, even closeness with people you've loved for years. But one day, you'll breathe easier. Not because they're gone, but because you've finally stopped abandoning yourself. Letting go isn't always dramatic. Sometimes, it's just a quiet unfollow, a canceled visit, a conversation you stop initiating. Other times, it's an earthquake, a confrontation, a boundary, a departure. Either way, the point is not destruction, it's liberation. Jung knew that when the soul outgrows its patterns, it will not rest until you make the outer world reflect the inner truth. A woman once told me that the moment she realized a long-time friendship had become toxic wasn't in an argument. It was during a quiet dinner when she felt herself laughing at a joke that made her skin crawl. And in that moment, she knew, I've outgrown this version of me. I can't keep showing up to these rehearsed performances. So she stopped. It hurt, but it healed. There's a kind of grief in growth that no one warns you about. The grief of letting go of what once felt like home. Even if it was dysfunctional, it was familiar. Even if it was unkind, it was known. But the self, as Jung taught, will not allow you to remain in false belonging. It wants you free, it wants you real, and that requires grief, because it also requires goodbye. You may look around and wonder where everyone went. The invitations may slow, the phone may go quiet. The places you once found comfort may now feel foreign. And in that silence, you may be tempted to return to the old crowd, the old rhythm. But trust this, what falls away when you rise is not meant to follow. What remains is what's meant to evolve with you. You learn to discern not just people, but patterns. The way certain habits keep you numb. The way certain spaces mute your spirit. The way certain language, small talk, forced smiles, polite lies makes you ache inside. And when you see it, you can't unsee it. You begin choosing truth, even when it's lonely. Because at last, you understand. Loneliness, with integrity, is far more nourishing than connection built on compromise. This is not the phase where everything becomes joyful. This is the phase where everything becomes honest. And that honesty is your new compass. You begin to ask, does this make me expand or contract? Does this person celebrate my growth or punish it? Does this version of life still fit the shape of my soul? And the answers, however painful, begin to guide your steps. Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of others. When you've done your inner work, you can finally see clearly the unspoken contracts you've kept. The way you allowed disrespect in the name of peace. The way you sacrificed authenticity for closeness. And when that recognition dawns, you don't rage, you release. You start to see that some people were chapters, not your whole story. Some environments were lessons, not your destination. Some beliefs were scaffolding, not the foundation. And letting them go is not betrayal. It is alignment. It is the sacred pruning that allows the soul to bear new fruit. You'll know you're healing when you stop explaining your boundaries. When you no longer feel guilt for choosing your well-being. When you meet silence not with fear but with rest. When you let go of the need to be chosen, because you've already chosen yourself. And from this place of clarity, life begins to respond differently. New connections appear, ones that don't require performance, ones that feel like ease. Opportunities align, not because you forced them, but because you made room. You're no longer attracting from lack. You're attracting from truth, and that changes everything. In Jung's eyes, this is the path of becoming whole, walking away not with anger, but with love for yourself. Shedding the past, not to escape it, but to honor who you've become. And as you continue forward, you'll find that what was never really yours cannot survive your growth, and what is truly yours will always rise to meet you. Eventually, you realize that it wasn't just your surroundings that were suffocating you. It was the role you learned to play inside of them. The friend, the achiever, the peacemaker, the one who never needed help, the one who always smiled. These identities once protected you, helped you belong, gave you a script when you had no language of your own. But now, the script feels stale, the costume itches, and the mask, it starts to crack. Carl Jung named this The persona, the mask we wear to meet the world, to fulfill social expectations, to hide the parts of ourselves that might be rejected or misunderstood. The persona is not evil. It is a tool, but the danger comes when we forget it is a mask at all, when we confuse the performance for the person, when the applause becomes so familiar that we start to think it's love. And then, one day, it happens. A moment, a crack. Perhaps someone says, "You've changed," and you no longer flinch. Or you sit in a room full of people who once knew you, and you feel strangely invisible, not because they've stopped seeing you, but because they never truly did. The mask is no longer working. And in that quiet devastation, something sacred stirs. You begin to wonder, who am I when I'm not performing? Who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I stop trying to be liked, accepted, useful? These questions don't have quick answers, but they are the doorway into your real life. Jung wrote that individuation requires us to withdraw our identification from the persona, to stop mistaking it for the self, to let it fall away, and to stand bare beneath it. This process feels like unraveling. The mask kept you warm. It kept you safe. Without it, you may feel exposed, unanchored. You may fumble through conversations, unsure how to speak without the old tone. You may look in the mirror and see someone unfamiliar. But this is not regression. This is reintroduction. You are meeting yourself, not the edited version, but the whole breathing being underneath. Some people won't recognize you anymore. And that's okay. You're not living to be recognized. You're living to be real. You stop posting things just to be validated. You stop saying yes to avoid discomfort. You stop contorting your truth to fit someone else's preference. And slowly, your life begins to take the shape of something less filtered and more free. You learn the beauty of silence, of not needing to respond right away, of not rushing to fill the space with explanations. You begin to let pauses linger, to let your presence be felt instead of your performance. And in that stillness, something unexpected happens. The self begins to breathe. The truest part of you starts to rise, timid at first, but stronger with every breath you take. You no longer need to be enough for anyone else, because you no longer believe you were ever not. You stop measuring yourself in outcomes. You stop apologizing for your evolution, and as the persona melts away, you begin to feel light. Not because life is easier, but because you are no longer carrying what isn't yours. Jung warned that without the breakdown of the persona, we can never meet the deeper self. That beneath every role we cling to is a shadow, longing for integration. When you drop the mask, you don't lose yourself. You find yourself. You begin to see your contradictions, not as flaws, but as texture. You begin to accept your softness, your anger, your grief, your wonder, all of it sacred, all of it yours. You begin living less for others and more from the center of your being. You don't need to broadcast your truth. You embody it. You walk into rooms not to impress, but to be. And your presence changes. People may not know why, but they feel it. You are no longer a mirror for their expectations. You are your own sun, radiating even when unnoticed. At first, this new way of living can feel lonely, because the world is still wearing masks, and you see them now, everywhere, on strangers, friends, even family, but you do not judge. You were there too, and so you hold space, you walk in truth, and eventually, others begin to follow, not because you told them to, but because your authenticity gave them permission to remove their own masks. You begin to rebuild, not a persona, but a life rooted in depth, honesty, slowness. You curate experiences that align with your soul. You protect your peace. You offer your energy with intention. You create, not to impress, but to express. And your life becomes not a stage, but a sanctuary. In Jung's eyes, this is the holy passage, the shedding of the false self, the return to the root. And though the world may resist it, may call you strange, distant, different, you will know the truth. You will feel it in your breath, your walk, your relationships. This is who I am, you'll whisper. And for the first time, your soul will answer back, yes. Welcome home. There's a quiet moment near the end of every great transformation. Not an ending, exactly, but a kind of sacred settling. You've walked through confusion, disconnection, questioning, longing, release. You've stripped away the roles, faced the shadow, honored your intuition, and now, standing at the threshold of this new terrain, you realize something profound. You were never becoming someone else. You were returning to someone you had always been. Carl Jung taught that the journey of individuation is not about self-improvement. It is about self-recovery. A return to wholeness. Not perfection, not performance, but integration. The willingness to gather all the parts of yourself you once denied, exiled, or feared, and say, even you belong. It is not light or shadow. It is light through shadow. It is not rising above the past. It is transforming within it. You no longer crave to be seen because you have learned to witness yourself. You no longer fear being misunderstood because your truth no longer needs to be translated. You stop asking life for permission to be who you are. You give that permission to yourself, and suddenly, the world around you begins to rearrange in quiet agreement. You become more present, more porous, less armored. You don't need to control every detail, because you've begun to trust your internal compass. You no longer chase signs. They come to you. You don't try to impress fate. You walk with it. You no longer grasp for destiny. You become an instrument through which it moves. There's no big announcement, no glowing transformation photo, just a softer gaze, a quieter smile, a life that feels less like survival and more like ceremony. You start speaking more slowly, choosing with more care, resting without guilt, loving with fewer conditions. Your life no longer needs to be impressive. It just needs to be yours. The people around you begin to notice. Some drift away, quietly. Others lean in, newly drawn to your presence. But you're no longer performing. You're no longer adjusting your temperature to make others more comfortable. You radiate steadily now, from within, and those meant for your warmth will feel it without needing explanation. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and begin asking, "What honors me?" You stop chasing timelines. You stop comparing journeys. You stop racing, and in that stillness, you discover the most radical truth of all. Nothing is missing. You are not late. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are just waiting for yourself. Jung wrote, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." You now know what that means, not as an idea, but as a living truth. You've looked inside, and what you found was not weakness. It was wisdom. It was a path forward that no map could ever show you, because it was written in the chambers of your own becoming. You begin to see every wound as a doorway, every season of loss as preparation, every silence as an invitation, every goodbye as a form of grace. You stop needing life to be easy. You only ask that it be real. And in return, life begins to give you that very thing, not in abundance, but in depth. You don't wake up one day fully healed. You simply stop using healing as a way to postpone living. You start creating again, dreaming again, loving again, not from a place of fear, but from a place of freedom. You've learned that even the tender, messy, unfinished version of you is worthy of joy. And when hard days come, and they will, you no longer crumble. You remember, you return, you recenter. You don't fear the dark anymore, because you've walked through it and found light inside. You don't avoid solitude anymore, because you've met yourself there and realized you were never alone. This is wholeness. Not a constant high, but a steady hum. A home within yourself. You can carry this version of you into any room, any challenge, any season, and remain intact. Not because you've figured everything out, but because you've finally stopped abandoning yourself to fit inside lives that weren't made for you. In the end, the soul doesn't ask you to be extraordinary. It asks you to be true. It doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to remember who you are beneath the noise. And when you live from that place, your life becomes its own quiet revolution, a sacred revolt against every false story, every borrowed identity, every small version of you that once begged for love. And so here you are, whole, becoming, awake, not in spite of the struggle, but because of it. Carl Jung would tell you, this was never about fixing your life. It was about remembering yourself. And now, with bare feet and an open heart, you finally begin to walk in the direction you were always meant to go.